Chapter 4 Project Fear. The hopes of the usurper were inspired by a belief that the citizens of Texas were disunited and divided in opinion. That alone has been the cause of the present invasion of our rights. He shall realize the fallacy of his hopes in the union of her citizens, and their eternal resistance to his plans against constitutional liberty. We will enjoy our birthright, or perish in its defense. Proclamation of Sam Houston. A call for volunteers. December 12, 1835. In September of 2014, the people of Scotland went to the polls to determine their future by answering one simple question. Should Scotland be an independent country? Centuries of longing for independence and decades of successful political struggle had been reduced to 6 words on a piece of paper. The simplicity of the question betrayed the complexity behind the decision each Scot was being asked to make. In the years ahead of the actual vote, the issue was hotly debated. The Scottish National Party had included the referendum as a major part of their election manifesto in the 2 previous general elections, and worked hard to make good on the promise. When the legal wrangling was over and a date for the referendum was set, 2 official campaigns emerged. Yes, Scotland, in favor of independence, and Better Together, in favor of remaining a part of the United Kingdom. On the first anniversary of the launch of the Better Together campaign, the Sunday Herald newspaper claimed, privately, some inside Better Together even refer to the organization as Project Fear. The name came from the acknowledgement that the primary tactic of Better Together was scaremongering. Indeed, fear is the favorite tactic of those in power who wish to motivate people to take a specific action or, in the case of Scotland and Texas, prevent them from asserting independence. Project Fear arguments in regard to TEXIT tend to fall into one of 3 broad categories. TEXIT is illegal. They won't let us. TEXIT is too hard. Gathered together into a single statement, the total argument flows along these lines. Texas can't leave the Union because it's illegal and unconstitutional. The Civil War settled it. Therefore, if Texas tried, the federal government would never let us. Even if it wasn't illegal, we're far too integrated with the United States, making it impossible to leave. But even if we were to somehow magically pull it off, we're simply not big enough or strong enough outside of the United States to be successful. We'd be bankrupt in 10 years and begging the United States to let us back in. The tenor of these arguments represents the fundamental problem with the vast majority of objections raised by TEXIT opponents. When the TEXIT version of Project Fear is confronted with facts and logic that concretely rebut its arguments or information that throws its conclusions and assumptions into question, it ignores the result and shifts to a different argument. Unable to keep its arguments from being shot down, the Project Fear strategy can be summed up in one sentence. Scare them as much as possible, as often as possible, and if you keep moving, they'll eventually miss. TEXIT is illegal and unconstitutional. A common accusation by those opposed to TEXIT is that the act of leaving the Union is illegal. Let's be clear. An accusation of the commission of an illegal act implies that those committing it are criminals guilty of a criminal act. Therefore, this is not a light accusation. When pressed, however, no one seems to be able to point to a specific law that forbids it. Scouring the federal statutes produces no joy for the accuser, as there is no law that explicitly forbids any state from asserting its independence. Given the passion with which this accusation is leveled, if it is not found in federal law, then surely it must exist in Texas statute. After all, the state of Nevada included one of the most strongly worded prohibitions on secession in its state constitution. But the paramount allegiance of every citizen is due to the federal government in the exercise of all its constitutional powers, as the same have been or may be defined by the Supreme Court of the United States, and no power exists in the people of this or any other state of the Federal Union to dissolve their connection therewith, or perform any act tending to impair, subvert, or resist the supreme authority of the government of the United States. However, there is no corresponding constitutional or statutory prohibition in Texas law either. It is a fundamental principle of American jurisprudence that something is illegal only if there is a law forbidding it. This is known as the legality principle, expressed in Latin as nullum crimen sine lege, nulla pena sine lege, meaning no crime without law, nor punishment without law. Paul H. Robinson, one of the world's leading criminal law scholars, described its modern application in 2005. In its modern form, it means that criminal liability and punishment can be based only upon a prior legislative enactment of a prohibition that is expressed with adequate precision and clarity. The principle is not a legal rule, but rather a legal concept embodied in a series of legal doctrines. If no law specifically prohibits a state from leaving the Union, then there must be some other law which, in their minds, applies in this instance. When pressed further, the accusation shifts to that of treason. The term treason has become an increasingly popular charge in this divisive political climate. While TEXIT advocates are the recipients of it at a higher than average rate, it has become far more common in federal partisan wrangling. Obama was accused of treason over the Iran nuclear deal, and Trump has been accused of treason for his alleged ties to the Russian government. However, those who seem to be quickest to use the term seem to be the most clueless as to its meaning. Drawing from an English statute from 1351 that was created to limit the scope of treason, the framers of the United States Constitution included a specific definition in Article 3, Section 3, which stated that treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Recognizing that accusations of treason were often the tool of tyrants, James Madison explained the necessity to clearly define it in Federalist 43. As treason may be committed against the United States, the authority of the United States ought to be enabled to punish it. But as new tangled and artificial treasons have been the great engines by which violent factions, the natural offspring of free governments, have usually wreaked their alternate malignity on each other, the Convention has with great judgment opposed a barrier to this peculiar danger by inserting a constitutional definition of the crime. Treason is a criminal act committed by an individual, not a political body, and, therefore, cannot be committed by a state. To continue to level the charge of treason, one must believe that the entirety of the population of Texas, who would vote in support of TEXIT, would be individually guilty of treason. This, however, completely ignores the constitutional definition of treason. Such a vote is not levying war against the United States unless one considers casting a ballot as an act of war, nor is it adhering to or giving aid and comfort to an enemy of the United States. If so, who would that enemy be? An enemy of the United States is someone who has been declared as such by the United States Congress, generally through a formal declaration of war. In this instance, North Korea might perhaps fit the bill, since the Korean War was never formally concluded. According to Carlton F. W. Larson, a professor of law at the University of California at Davis, certain non-state actors can also count as enemies, and terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State probably fit the definition. Adhering to the enemy would mean that voting for TEXIT was, in fact, joining North Korea or the Islamic State. Giving aid and comfort would mean that voting for TEXIT was, in fact, providing concrete and material support to the same. neither of these apply. When confronted with the lack of basis for the charge of treason, the final charge is that of attempting to overthrow the government. In fairness, there is a federal statute in Title 18 of the U.S. Code that outlaws attempts to do that very thing. In its entirety, it reads, "Whoever knowingly or willfully advocates, abets, advises, or teaches the duty, necessity, desirability, or propriety of overthrowing or destroying the government of the United States or the government of any state, territory, district, or possession thereof, or the government of any political subdivision therein, by force or violence, or by the assassination of any officer of any such government, or whoever with intent to cause the overthrow or destruction of any such government prints, publishes, edits, issues, circulates, sells, distributes, or publicly displays any written or printed matter advocating, advising, or teaching the duty, necessity, desirability, or propriety of overthrowing or destroying any government in the United States by force or violence, or attempts to do so, or whoever organizes or helps or attempts to organize any society, group, or assembly of persons who teach, advocate, or encourage the overthrow or destruction of any such government by force or violence, or becomes or is a member of, or affiliates with, any such society, group, or assembly of persons, knowing the purposes thereof, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 20 years or both, and shall be ineligible for employment by the United States or any department of agency thereof for the 5 years next following his conviction. The operative words in the statute are force or violence, and given that a TEXIT, initiated by a legal process, ratified by a vote of the people of Texas, and secured by a declaration of the reclamation of the right of self-determination, is neither force nor violence, this accusation falls as well. Once the argument of illegality lies in ruins, the fallback position is to loudly declare that it is unconstitutional for a state to leave the Union. However, the accusation of unconstitutionality shares a fundamental and fatal flaw with the accusation of illegality. There is not a single clause in the Constitution of the United States that forbids Texas, or any state for that matter, from leaving the Union. In this case, the constitutional silence is extremely important. The Constitution of the United States actually defines the specific acts states are forbidden from committing in Article 1, Section 10. No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. No state shall, without the consent of the Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports, except what may be absolutely necessary for executing its inspection laws, and the net produce of all duties and imposts laid by any state on imports or exports shall be for the use of the Treasury of the United States, and all such laws shall be subject to the revision and control of the Congress. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops, or ships of war in time of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state, or with a foreign power, or engage in war, unless actually invaded, or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. Nowhere in the remainder of the Constitution is the issue of a state leaving the Union explicitly forbidden, nor is power ceded to the federal government to prohibit one from doing so. In this silence, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution rings loudly. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. This deafening constitutional silence coupled with the definitive reservation of power by the states, leaves the decision to the people of a state and to those people alone. Not so fast, say the critics. What about the Supreme Court case of Texas versus White? Didn't that say that secession was unconstitutional? The entire legal argument for the unconstitutionality of states leaving the Union rests on the Supreme Court's decision in the 1869 case of Texas versus White. However, when it comes to Texas versus White, more and more academics are adopting the stance of historian Dr. Brian McClanahan. When asked that very question at an academic conference in Florida, his response was as indignant. So what? Dr. McClanahan's attitude toward Texas versus White is not based on a denial of facts. In fact, contrary to the concrete pronouncements by TEXIT detractors, the decision in Texas versus White has been debated and debunked extensively, starting from the moment Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase issued the majority opinion. The dissenting opinion, issued by Justice Robert C. Greer, highlighted many of the deficiencies of the Supreme Court's ruling, stating that he disagreed on all points raised and decided. The assertions made by Chase were so offensive to his contemporaries that Union and Confederate sympathizers, both fresh from the battlefields and still harboring deep divisions, were united in their contempt for his ruling. Bristling at the usurpation by the judiciary of the power to determine political questions, Lyman Trumbull, a United States Senator from Illinois, introduced legislation that in part stated, "Under the Constitution, the judicial power of the United States does not embrace political power, or give to judicial tribunals any authority to question the political departments of the government on political questions." There is no doubt that Chief Justice Chase, an appointee of Abraham Lincoln, used the opportunity presented by Texas versus White to stamp a retroactive seal of approval on the federal government's policies and actions during the Civil War. To do so, Chase had to rewrite history and virtually all established law on the subject. To reinforce his belief that the United States was a perpetual union, he had to assert the ludicrous argument that the United States Constitution was merely an amending document to the previous Articles of Confederation, citing the preamble to the Constitution. He then had to ignore that it only took 9 states of the original 13 to ratify the Constitution of 1787, and that had less than 13 states ratified, it would have destroyed the perpetual union allegedly created by the Articles of Confederation. To reinforce his assertion that the United States was an indestructible union composed of indestructible states, Chase had to ignore the existence of West Virginia and the agreement with the Republic of Texas upon its admission, that it could divide into 4 additional states, and that those additional states would be guaranteed admission into the Union if they so choose. To reinforce his assertion that states, upon entering the Union, gave up all rights of sovereignty and became incorporated into a single monolithic superstate, Chase had to ignore every reference to the states as individual political entities in the Declaration of Independence, the aforementioned Articles of Confederation, the Northwest Ordinance, the United States Constitution, and all intent of the framers, clearly expressed in the period. In his zeal to confirm the supremacy of the Union, Chase ascribed qualities to it that are usually reserved for deities. In effect, he equated the Union to God, and established a quasi-religious orthodoxy that requires adherence to a doctrine that elevates the federal government to godhood, its 3 branches to the Holy Trinity, and the judiciary as its holy priesthood. There is no doubt that, had the states been exposed to Chase's logic during deliberations over the ratification of the Constitution, they would have soundly rejected it and likely drafted a new Declaration of Independence. The Supreme Court was not and never will be perfect. Some of the most heinous, morally reprehensible, logically flawed decisions have emanated from the Supreme Court. To imbue it with infallibility is to say that when it upheld slave catching or when it upheld racial segregation, it was right. Yet decisions by the court in both of those instances have been overturned. Even Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., in the 1904 case of Northern Securities Company versus the United States, recognized that the court could be caught up in the politics and passions of the day and render bad decisions. Great cases, like hard cases, make bad law. For great cases are called great, not by reason of their importance, but because of some accident of immediate overwhelming interest which appeals to the feelings and distorts the judgment. With all its obvious flaws, some academics continue to point to Texas versus White as the silver bullet that handles all questions related to states separating from the Union. However, others tend to glide over it so as not to have to acknowledge its most significant problem. Embracing Texas versus White requires one to believe that the last 150 years never happened. Since 1869, the world kept spinning. Generations have come and gone, and the Supreme Court has continued to issue rulings that chip away at the foundations of Texas versus White. As the entirety of Chase's determination is predicated on the claim that perpetual union is the more perfect union spoken of in the preamble of the Constitution, the single ruling by the court in the 1905 case of Jacobson versus Massachusetts, where it was determined that the federal government can gain no power based on the preamble, could utterly destroy Texas versus White. The federal government's position on self-determination has evolved to the point of signing international agreements, covenants, and treaties pledging to respect the right of self-determination. The same chorus of voices who declare that Texas versus White is the end-all, be-all of decisions on the matter of self-determination of the states are the same voices who declare that subsequent rulings by the Supreme Court obligate the federal government and the states to give treaty obligations, such as those dealing with self-determination, the same weight as constitutional law, and argue for its application as such. Ultimately, though, any question of self-determination is political in nature. It is not, and never will be, a judicial question. Perhaps recognizing this fact and hoping to avoid any serious examination of the constitutionality of the question in general, and Texas versus White specifically, those opposed to TEXIT quickly move on to their next argument. Justice Antonin Scalia is often cited using the next argument. Taken from a letter written to an aspiring screenwriter, Scalia declared, "If there was any constitutional issue resolved by the Civil War, it is that there is no right to secede." This is also a sentiment echoed by Paul Finkelman, a senior fellow in the Penn Program on Democracy, Citizenship, and Constitutionalism at the University of Pennsylvania, and a scholar in residence at the National Constitution Center in a 2015 column in the New York Times. In short, nullification and secession were not new ideas in 1861, when 11 states left the Union, but had been part of the warp and weft of constitutional debate since the founding. But the Civil War ended the discussion. The question of the constitutionality of nullification or secession was permanently settled by the legal case of Lee versus Grant, decided at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. This refrain is echoed more often than any other, and is where fear truly enters into the strategy of Project Fear. It is a quick retort that is meant to stifle all further debate on the issue through intimidation. Let's be honest. The assertions of the illegality or constitutionality of a state leaving the Union and that the Civil War settled the issue, although often linked, are truly two separate and distinct arguments. The former deals with a point of law that can be discussed, debated, and a definitive conclusion reached. The latter is a thinly veiled threat of violence, often used as a tactic by bullies, abusers of women and children, and tin-pot dictators propping up tyrannical regimes. However, this argument also poses a significant legal, political, and moral problem for the United States and the world. If the military conquest of the states that seceded during the 1860s was the point at which the question of leaving the Union was settled, does this mean that all political questions, especially those related to self-determination, are deemed as perpetually solved by the use of force? In a larger geopolitical sense, think about how that principle would have played out in the 20th century. When Germany invaded Poland, touching off the Second World War, how much different would the world be if the response from the United States was, "I guess that settles that"? Or Japan's successful invasion of the Philippines. MacArthur's response was, "I shall return." It wasn't. It is now settled that the Philippines are now an indivisible and inseparable part of the Empire of Japan. Advocates of this line of thinking are missing the forest for the trees. If the Civil War truly did settle this issue, then no one would even be discussing it. It would be a fact. Establishment politicians, academia, and the media throw around the word consensus as though everyone agrees that the Civil War settled the issue and that anyone who disagrees is an outlier. Take, for instance, Harvey Tucker, political science professor at Texas A&M, whose position on the matter has been parroted by other professors and regurgitated by a lazy media. According to Tucker, among scholars, the consensus is that the Civil War settled all these issues. Texas does not have the right to secede. Tucker, and those like him, ignore the ongoing scholarship on the issue and instead opt for a soundbite offered by a definitive declaration. The media largely ignores the numerous academic conferences held over the last 20 years dealing with the right of secession, the impact of international law on the right of self-determination, and the constitutional history of secession, many of them taking place in the United States, with notable U.S. scholars. If the Civil War definitively and decisively settled the issue of separation from the Union, apparently the larger academic community didn't get the memo. The TEXIT question, though, is not one that is left solely to academics and their discussions of political and legal theory. What matters most on this political question is not whether the Civil War settled it, but whether the people of Texas believe that a question was settled that they've never been properly asked. The growth of support for TEXIT clearly shows that fewer and fewer Texans consider the result of the Civil War the final answer to the independence question. The federal government won't let Texas leave. There is little doubt that the federal government and its supporters will spend enormous sums of money lobbying against giving Texans even a vote on independence. When it reaches the ballot, they'll spend even more in an actual campaign, trying to persuade Texans that TEXIT will bring certain calamity. If they fail in that, what recourse do they have? When all arguments fail, the fallback is the threat of creating a sequel to the American Civil War. Civil War II. American Harder. It is interesting to note that in recent years, as the federal government has had to comment on the issue of TEXIT, no elected official has ever made this threat. The Obama White House, in its official response to the 2012 TEXIT petition, never threatened the use of force to keep Texas in the Union. While they did invoke the Civil War, it was done as a gateway to invoking the Supreme Court decision in Texas versus White. In fact, when Donald Trump was asked about TEXIT in 2016, he declared that Texas' love for him would keep us in. Instead, it's the federal apologists who throw out their apocalypse porn version of how events would unfold. If Texas leaves, the federal government will empty out Fort Hood, arrest the Texas government, and shoot everyone who voted for independence. Don't laugh. Some form of that statement has been sincerely offered by many of those opposed to TEXIT. Most publicly, it was uttered in a debate by a member of the Texas State Republican Executive Committee while speaking in opposition to placing a non-binding TEXIT question on the primary ballot. This came from a man whose party reveres President Ronald Reagan for his call to the Soviet Union to respect the right of self-determination for the countries behind the Iron Curtain. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. Often, though, those who tender this argument are the same crowd that wants to reshape U.S. domestic policy to look more like Europe. However, in modern-day Europe, there is not a single example to show Europe has a thirst to use military power to override self-determination on the continent. There are no examples of the British threatening to use force to keep Scotland in the UK ahead of Scotland's 2014 independence referendum, and there has been no mobilization of troops on the European continent preparing to invade Britain in the wake of the Brexit vote. Indeed, those who are quickest to jump to the conclusion that TEXIT would invite a military invasion by the federal government are some of the harshest critics of U.S. military interventions around the world. When we hear this excuse from non-Texans, it's delivered with a harshness that betrays a deep-seated desire to simply wipe Texas off the map. When it's heard from Texans, it's with a meekness more befitting Moses Rose, the only man who, according to legend, fled the Alamo, than to the heroes of the Texas Revolution. Either way, it's another fantastical scenario used to avoid serious discussion and debate on the merits of independence, a debate these Texans feel sure they will lose. One cannot reasonably assume that the policy of the federal government from the mid-19th century would be the policy of the federal government 2 decades into the 21st. There's no current federal policy regarding a state leaving the Union. However, there is current federal policy regarding states and territories leaving currently established political and economic institutions. Those policies involve neutrality, or the use of military action in support of self-determination. Imagine the scenario. 15 million Texans have gone to the polls and voted in a free, fair, and open referendum, conducted under the laws of the state of Texas, and have chosen, by a majority vote, to leave the Union and assert Texas' status as a free and independent self-governing nation-state. Historically, around the world, voter turnout for independence referenda is 85 to 90%. Taking the low end, that would mean that 12.75 million Texans would cast their vote in the referendum. Figuring the lowest possible threshold for an independence victory, approximately 6.4 million Texans would vote in favor of independence. If the federal government opts for a military solution, how would it handle the 6.4 million Texans who voted in favor of independence? Prison? Extermination? What would the justification be for any actions taken against Texans whose sole crime was voting for self-determination in a fair, free, and open referendum? When exactly would this military intervention occur? Would they do it before a vote on TEXIT to prevent the people from having their say? Would they wait until after the results of the vote were tallied and the results announced in favor of independence? Or would they wait until after Texas began the process of extracting itself from the federal system and began asserting its role as a nation among nations? Under close scrutiny, it becomes apparent that the federal government will not move to stop TEXIT once it's been decided by the people of Texas, and they most certainly won't use the military. It's just too impractical. First, there would be little to no public support for military action against Texans who voted to leave the Union. A 2011 IBOP-Zogby poll found that 43% of respondents believed that states had justification for leaving the Union. For those who consider themselves conservatives, that number jumps to 65%. Military action against Texas, in the absence of some morally reprehensible act, would require a strong consensus from the remaining states and the people in those states. The strong liberal states would likely fall on the side of letting Texas go. The strong conservative states would be split on the issue, but would largely be supportive of the basic principle of self-government. With numbers like these, a consensus seems implausible. The use of military force would bring a swift condemnation from the international community and would damage international relations for years to come. Some countries would likely impose economic sanctions on the United States until the civilian government of Texas was restored and the results of the independence vote respected. It would also cause a tectonic shift in international policy related to the support of democratic institutions, essentially delegitimizing any efforts made by the United States past, present, and future. You would have to believe that troops would obey an order to fire on millions of Texas civilians and their leaders whose only crime was invoking their right of self-government. With approximately 170,000 Texans serving in the United States Armed Forces, it would be difficult to get compliance. The ultimate irony is that any Texan in the United States military who took up arms against the lawfully elected government of Texas or its citizens would be guilty of treason under Article 1, Section 22 of the Texas Constitution. A 2009 poll from the aforementioned Zogby poll showed a large number of military personnel and their families believed that states had an absolute right to leave the Union. As published in Forbes, 42% of members of the armed forces and 41% of people who have a family member active in the armed forces agree secession is a right. The fact that 42% view it as a right carries weight. It means they view it as a fundamental freedom, like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Just as it is unlikely that the military would act against those rights when exercised by the civilian population, it is equally unlikely that they would act against TEXIT. The most likely scenario, if an order of this nature was given, would be outright disobedience from the highest levels of the military all the way down to the enlisted ranks by at least 42% of the military, if not all. If some component of the military followed through on the order, it would likely trigger a domino effect where other states, outraged by the disregard for the political will of the people of Texas, would skip to the end of the process and unilaterally declare independence. Texas might be the first to leave, but if the federal government used the military to suppress the result, it certainly would not be the last. Although the lack of public support and the impracticality of military action are significant factors, the real reason the federal government won't stop Texas from leaving the Union is one of the most biggest drivers of federal policy: economics. Economics hate disruption. TEXIT would no doubt be disruptive, but it comes down to what is more disruptive. Ordering military intervention would be economically disruptive and would create shockwaves throughout the U.S. and global economies. Carrying out any type of military intervention would be even worse. The best course of action for the United States would be to mitigate disruption in the most practical way it can, at the negotiating table. It is the most practical choice open to the federal government in dealing with a successful TEXIT vote. To illustrate the oversized role that practicality plays in this arena, one only needs to look at the statements from the federal government on Brexit. In his now infamous visit to the UK, President Obama told the British people that if they voted to leave the European Union, the United States would place the UK at the back of the queue in negotiating a trade deal. The British people voted to leave the European Union anyway. Now the federal government is currently at the table with the UK, laying the groundwork for a trade deal. When faced with the choice of irrationally shunning the world's fifth largest economy, with a GDP only $1 trillion greater than Texas, or rationally executing a trade deal, the federal government chose the practical route. It is far easier to negotiate a free trade agreement with a Texas that's on its way out the door than it is to militarily occupy its capital in Austin. It is easier to negotiate a currency union with Texas than it is to deal with the possibility of massive insubordination in your military. With a negotiated separation, the federal government has the opportunity to show that it believes in the principles that it has espoused around the world for the last 70 years. It is better to keep goods and services flowing than to have them come to a dead stop. Forced integration into the Union at the point of a gun invites international condemnation and the loss of credibility on the international stage for the next 70 years. TEXIT is too difficult. There are some out there who, not really understanding Texans, offer the final and, frankly, weakest arguments against TEXIT. Texas is too integrated with the United States, so it's impossible to separate. If Texas does manage to separate, we'd never make it on our own. It is true that Texas is highly integrated with the United States. However, these political and economic ties are not so tight or intricately interwoven that it would be impossible to untangle them. In many instances, it wouldn't be necessary to untangle them at all. There is no part of the relationship between Texas and the rest of the United States that couldn't be accomplished by utilizing existing state-level institutions and agencies, executing bilateral agreements between Texas and the United States, or by Texas signing on to multilateral international agreements that are already in place. Is the issue trade? Countries, including the United States, trade with one another every hour of every day and have done so for all of recorded human history. The free trade agreements that the United States already has in place for 20 other countries around the world treat trade with them as though they were one of the states of the Union. Yet no one would argue that any of those countries are inseparable members of the Federal Union. Texas could execute a free trade agreement with the United States and adopt the United States tariff schedule with the World Trade Organization for external trade, and no one would even notice the difference. Is the issue currency? If Texas needed or wanted to, it could adopt the U.S. dollar as its official currency in an informal currency union like many other countries have done. We don't need permission to do it. However, if Texas were so inclined and the United States were amiable, we could enter into an official currency union with the United States. Scotland proposed a similar move for itself and the United Kingdom ahead of its independence vote. This would be similar to the formal currency union that exists throughout the European Union. Is the issue banking? Foreign banks are allowed to operate in the United States at this very moment with no trouble. That includes large retail banks like Compass and HSBC. In fact, more banks in Texas are state-chartered and state-regulated than those that are federally chartered and regulated. Is the issue federal pension benefits? People live outside of the United States and collect their federal pensions, including Social Security, every month. The Social Security Administration has an entire section on its website and publishes numerous informational documents on this subject. Through totalization agreements with other countries, U.S. citizens work outside the United States and continue to pay into the United States Social Security system and vice versa. Is the issue travel? Cars, planes, trucks, and trains move between the United States and other countries every day. Over 1 million people per day legally cross the border between the United States and Mexico for work or travel, using only a border crossing card. No passport needed. This is essentially no different than traveling between Texas and Oklahoma, Louisiana, or New Mexico. Perhaps the concerns are more about having the money to continue certain functions of government. Not a problem. Simple arithmetic proves the ability of an independent Texas to fund a government at the same level that Texans are currently accustomed to if that's what Texans want. Texans currently pay, in all, federal and state taxes of $336 billion per year. This represents the total amount of revenue readily available to an independent Texas without increasing the financial burden on Texans 1 single cent. From that amount, subtract the amount spent by both the federal government and state government in Texas. $228 billion is the total amount of expenditures required to maintain every program, every job, both civilian and military, every department, every facility, including military bases, and fulfill every function, including current federal contract spending to Texas companies, provided by the federal and state governments. This level of government revenue would rank Texas 12th in the world for government revenue collected. Somehow, since 1945, 140 new, formerly dependent countries have been able to make it as independent, self-governing nation-states. The unspoken assertion is that to be able to do anything that Texas would have to do as an independent nation, it must be a part of the United States. The implication is that Texas and Texans aren't as good, as smart, or as capable as other nations. This requires them to ignore the truth about how Texas stacks up against other self-governing countries in the world. In every category in which nation-states are traditionally compared, Texas overperforms. Texas has the 10th largest economy in the world. Texas ranks 40th in the world in size. Texas ranks 47th in the world in population. Texas ranks 40th in the world in the size of its labor force. Texas is a net global exporter, ranking 22nd in the world, leading all other states in the United States. 93% of Texas exports are manufactured exports. Texas is the 12th largest technology exporter in the world. Texas ranks 19th in the world in the size of its active farms and ranches. Texas is the largest energy producer in the United States, accounting for more than half of the entire United States energy production and 1/4 of the refining capacity, with over 26 petroleum refineries. Texas has the 7th largest coal reserves. Texas is the 6th largest producer of wind energy in the world. Texas has its own power grid. These statistics, while impressive, don't tell the whole story. Texas not only does well in spite of the federal government, Texas is already structurally capable of doing everything that is traditionally done by a national government. In Texas, you will also find a state-level analog for every single cabinet-level federal department. Texas even has its own military. The Texas Military Department is composed of 3 branches of the military in the state of Texas. These branches are the Texas Army National Guard, the Texas Air National Guard, and the Texas State Guard. All 3 branches are administered by the State Adjutant General, an appointee of the Governor of Texas, and fall under the command of the Texas Governor. The State Guard, which is exclusively under the command of the Governor, is divided into 6 Army regiments, 2 air wings, 3 maritime regiments, and 3 medical battalions. The Texas Army National Guard consists of the 36th Infantry Division, 71st Troop Command, and the 176th Engineering Brigade. The Texas Army National Guard consists of the 36th Infantry Division, 71st Troop Command, and the 176th Engineering Brigade. The Texas Air National Guard consists of the 149th Fighter Wing, 147th Attack Wing, and the 136th Airlift Wing. Contrary to the opinion of some, Texas' attachment to the federal system is not a special case. There is no union in recent history with more power aggregated into a central government than the Soviet Union. Within an even tighter integration and under extreme economic stress, its constituent republics were able to extract themselves and become fully functioning nation-states. If the United States has truly become more centrally controlled than the Soviet Union, then it's no longer the United States. It has become the United State and no longer represents the vision of its founders. If those who believe that separation is too difficult are to be believed, and today it is too complicated, tomorrow it will be more so, and the day after harder still. If this argument is true, then Texas is destined to fall even deeper into the depths of the federal system until Texas is only a distant memory that exists in a history book. It is a false argument and one that strikes counter to everything Texans have historically believed about themselves. It runs contrary to the reputation gained by Texans around the world. It is the same argument made by helicopter parents for why their children should still live at home well into their 30s. And it's the excuse used by socially stunned adults well into their 30s as to why they still live with mommy and daddy. Ultimately, Texans bristle at the suggestion that we simply aren't good enough to govern ourselves. We reject the idea that independence can't be done, as we remember the old adage that if you want something done, tell a Texan that it can't be done. The real question is this: given all our natural advantages, if Texas can't make it as an independent nation, then who can? The fall of Project Fear. In 2016, Republican supporters of TEXIT were standing up in county conventions all over Texas to fight for a vote on the issue. But in Jefferson County, the debate took a fiery turn when independence supporters were accused of being criminals. During the debate on the Texas Independence Resolution, which called for a vote on Texas reasserting its status as an independent nation, one pro-federal Republican took his opportunity to accuse all TEXIT supporters of the crimes of sedition. Unfortunately for him, one of the delegates to the Jefferson County Convention was me. Using Robert's Rules of Order, I immediately called a point of order and demanded an apology. As someone who has worked for the independence of Texas for 20 years, which is guaranteed in Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Bill of Rights, I consider it a personal attack on everyone who believes in Texas independence to publicly accuse us of a crime, and I demand an apology. No apology was forthcoming, but the resolution passed the convention by a large margin. Not satisfied with the result, the same delegate introduced a resolution that again leveled the charge of sedition and called for neutering Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Bill of Rights. After his impassioned and frenetic fear-mongering for the resolution, where he directly accused the TNM and its members of sedition, I again responded. If this gentleman truly believes that we are guilty of a crime, then a resolution is not the best avenue to deal with this matter. If we're committing a crime, go call 911. The room erupted in applause, and his resolution was massively defeated. It was proof that fear is a weak weapon, and when someone attempts to use it against a Texan, it will backfire more often than it will work. This is the risk that opponents of TEXIT seem all too willing to accept, and it's why, in the long run, it will fail. Texans do not respond to threats and fear by capitulation. Instead, it's a surefire way to get Texans to do exactly the opposite. A perfect example of how these tactics backfire happened in 2017 in the run-up to the Catalan independence referendum. The Spanish central government chose a strategy of threats and fear to dissuade the people of Catalonia from holding a referendum. They held it anyway. The government chose a strategy of threat, fear, and violence to prevent people from participating in the referendum. People participated anyway. Even as the Spanish batons were crushing Catalan skulls and grandmothers were assaulted at polling locations, the pure joy expressed by the Catalan people in exercising their right of self-determination was transcendent. Even after the vote in favor of independence, the Spanish government found itself faced with the end result of their campaign of fear. More people support independence now than did prior to the referendum. Ana Pusa, who is Spanish by birth but grew up in Catalonia, commented to Fox News that they don't realize how many people they converted. Hearing myself saying, "I'm Spanish," sounds strange, because now it means something different. Project Fear is exactly that, fear. Fear can be healthy. It can challenge us to avoid dangers that are avoidable. It can cause us to act towards self-preservation to protect our families. But Project Fear is the worst kind of fear. It is an irrational fear whose sole purpose is to cause Texans to act against their best interests. It is used as a tool of oppression, to convince a strong people they're weak, to rob them of a heritage of freedom, and to denigrate them into accepting an inferior position in the world. To paraphrase author Frank Herbert, fear truly is the mind killer. Project Fear makes wild assertions, posits impossible scenarios, and allows those who employ its tactics an opportunity to avoid the personal responsibility of being informed and engaging in rational debate. Their incessant questions betray their greatest weakness, their inability to withstand scrutiny and give fact-based, rational answers to legitimate questions. The influence once held by the Texas version of Project Fear is waning as Texans begin turning the tables. No longer satisfied with smug answers from the opposition, TEXIT supporters are asking their own questions. The most important question is, if Texas were already an independent nation, given what I know about the federal government, would I vote to join the Union? The lack of real answers or legitimate alternatives from Project Fear is proving that they are, as Texans say, all hat and no cattle.